March 2003, southern Iraq. The first night of the invasion had already stripped away the illusion of clarity. Visibility collapsed under a sandstorm that turned headlights into halos and tracers into brief streaks of orange swallowed by dust. The wind carried the smell of oil and cordite across the flat ground near the Al-Faw Peninsula. U.S. Marines positioned along their boundary lines were tracking movement through optics that struggled to cut through the storm. Radios crackled with clipped updates. Reports came in fragments. Landing zones secured, contact intermittent, resistance uneven. They knew the British were going in. What they did not know was how it would unfold. Many Marines expected something steady but restrained. Professional, yes, capable certainly, but measured. Perhaps slower to press in those conditions. Perhaps more deliberate in the face of low visibility and uncertain enemy positions. Instead, through the dust and firelight, they saw 40 Commando pushing forward. Not recklessly, not dramatically, but without hesitation. Small teams moved through burning infrastructure and palm groves with a level of cohesion that was immediately noticeable even at distance. There was no visible confusion in their spacing, no clustering, no stalled elements waiting for clearer orders. They advanced as if the storm were an inconvenience, not a barrier. Inside armored vehicles and temporary command posts, Marines watched feeds, listened to relayed reports, and began to reassess their expectations in real time. It wasn't what they were seeing that surprised them. It was what they weren't seeing. No loss of tempo. No audible panic over the net. No pause waiting for conditions to improve. For some American officers, that was the first signal that this night would not match their assumptions. They thought they understood how the British would fight. By midnight, it was clear they were going to learn something new. To understand why that first night carried weight beyond the immediate firefight, you have to understand what Al-Faw represented. The peninsula was not symbolic ground. It was functional ground. Al-Faw controlled access to Iraq's southern oil infrastructure. Pipelines, pumping stations, offshore terminals, and shipping channels that handled the vast majority of the country's export capacity ran through that narrow strip of land. If those facilities were destroyed in the opening hours of the war, the economic consequences would extend far beyond Iraq itself. The coalition had seen this before. In 1991, retreating Iraqi forces had set Kuwaiti oil fields ablaze. The fires burned for months. The environmental damage was severe. The financial damage was immense. The psychological effect was deliberate. There was no assumption that Saddam's forces would hesitate to repeat that tactic. Intelligence assessments before the invasion were cautious but clear. Demolition charges were likely pre-positioned. Command structures existed to execute destruction orders quickly. Fedayeen units were known to operate in the area with a mandate to sabotage. If the oil infrastructure went up in flames on the first night, it would complicate everything that followed. It would slow humanitarian planning. It would alter political calculations in London and Washington. It would create a visible image of chaos before Baghdad had even been reached. For the United States command structure, that meant Al-Faw was not a secondary objective. It was a stabilizing objective, a necessary one. But the terrain itself made the task unusually difficult. Flat, open approaches offered little natural cover. Mudflats limited heavy vehicle maneuver. Narrow causeways and industrial corridors created choke points. The weather that night made aerial visibility unreliable and ground coordination more dependent on discipline than on technology. The British were assigned the mission not as a courtesy, but because they had amphibious capability, Royal Marine experience, and the logistical structure to operate independently along that coastal axis. From the American side of the boundary line, there was professional respect for that assignment, but there was also quiet evaluation. If Al-Faw fell quickly and cleanly, the southern flank would stabilize. If it stalled, it would create a distraction at the worst possible moment. The Marines advancing north understood that their own tempo depended, in part, on how efficiently that peninsula was secured. So when 40 Commando launched into that sandstorm, this was not a small, isolated engagement being observed out of curiosity. It was the first operational test of whether the southern front would hold. And in war, early signals matter. The Americans were watching not just for victory, but for indicators of speed, of cohesion, of friction. What they saw would begin shaping their view of their British counterparts within hours. The sandstorm was not theatrical. It was operationally disruptive. By late evening, visibility had dropped to a few meters in places. Rotor wash amplified airborne dust into thick brown walls. Optical systems degraded. Depth perception distorted. Navigation became almost entirely dependent on instruments and disciplined crew coordination. American aviation elements assigned to support portions of the opening assault began reassessing risk. Weather was not a secondary factor. It directly affected survivability. Helicopters operating at low altitude in reduced visibility face compounding dangers: spatial disorientation, loss of formation spacing, collision risk, degraded landing accuracy. On paper, delaying the assault until conditions improved was defensible, but delay carried its own consequences. Every additional hour gave Iraqi units time to react. Every pause increased the risk of demolition orders being executed. Every shift in timeline introduced uncertainty into the broader operational plan. British commanders evaluated the same information. They knew the storm increased risk. They also knew that surprise was greatest in conditions the enemy would assume were unusable. This was not a reckless choice. It was a calculated one. Royal Navy and Royal Air Force crews operating Sea Kings and Chinooks flew largely on instruments, holding tight internal discipline in formation spacing. Landing zones that had been rehearsed in clear conditions were now approached through partial instrument procedures and dead reckoning. For the Marines inside those aircraft, uncertainty was total. They could not see the ground clearly. They could not assess enemy movement visually before touchdown. They had to trust that navigation was correct, timing was synchronized, and adjacent elements were landing roughly where they were supposed to. From the American perspective, watching feeds, monitoring communications, this was the first moment of genuine attention. Because uncertainty exposes culture. Some units wait for clarity, others operate through it. The helicopters did not abort. They continued. Landing zones were hit. Units disembarked. Initial objectives were moved on quickly to prevent enemy regrouping. There were complications. Orientation had to be confirmed on the ground. Small elements had to re-establish visual contact in limited visibility, but cohesion held. What the U.S. Marines noticed was not bravado. It was tempo maintained under degraded conditions. The British did not appear hurried. They did not appear chaotic. They did not appear dependent on perfect visibility to function. That mattered, because Marines understand weather as friction, and friction reveals whether discipline is procedural or cultural. By choosing to proceed into the storm, 40 Commando demonstrated something that does not show up on equipment manifests or force ratios. They were comfortable operating inside uncertainty. And that, more than the sandstorm itself, was the first signal that night would be remembered differently than expected. The first contact was not dramatic. It was confused, short, and difficult to interpret in the storm. Royal Marines hit the ground expecting resistance around key oil installations and defensive positions along the Al-Faw Peninsula. Intelligence had warned of regular Iraqi army units, Fedayeen fighters, and local militia elements. No one expected the ground to be empty, but the sandstorm distorted sound and distance. Initial small arms fire was sporadic. Muzzle flashes were visible only in brief bursts, through dust and flame reflection from distant oil facilities. Identification was harder than normal. Marines had to confirm orientation quickly, establish arcs of fire, and prevent fratricide under reduced visibility. This is where U.S. Marine observers, both embedded liaison officers and adjacent units monitoring the fight, began paying close attention. The British did not respond with immediate saturation fire. They responded with control. Fire discipline was maintained. Section leaders moved methodically. Orders were short, clear, and procedural. Machine guns were used deliberately to suppress identified firing points rather than to blanket terrain. That restraint was not softness. It was precision under degraded conditions. Some Iraqi resistance elements attempted to exploit the weather. Small teams fired and shifted. A few bunkers and defensive positions had to be cleared by hand. Grenades were used. Anti-armor weapons were deployed when fortified structures required it, but there was no loss of cohesion. Radio traffic remained measured. No evidence of panic. No uncontrolled escalation of firepower. To U.S. Marines listening in, that detail mattered. Urban and semi-urban fights can unravel quickly at night, especially in poor visibility. The risk of overreaction is high. A single unexpected engagement can cascade into disproportionate response. Instead, 40 Commando operated as if visibility were a tactical complication, not a psychological one. Within hours, key oil terminals and pumping facilities were secured. Engineers began assessment procedures. Special boat service elements secured offshore platforms before demolition charges could be activated. The tempo was steady. Not rushed, not stalled. The first engagements did not produce dramatic headlines. They produced something more significant. Confirmation. Confirmation that the British assault element had landed intact. Confirmation that command and control held under pressure. Confirmation that limited visibility did not translate into loss of initiative. From the American side of the boundary line, this was the moment when perception shifted. Because Marines judge other units by how they handle first contact. And that night, what they saw was a force that absorbed friction, maintained discipline, and continued advancing toward objectives without visible disruption. There was no theatrical breakthrough, just methodical progress through chaos. And that, in professional terms, carries weight. U.S. Marines are not easily impressed, especially in 2003. Many of the officers observing that first night beside 40 Commando had grown up professionally inside a doctrine built around tempo, massed firepower, and shock action. They respected aggression. They respected speed. They respected overwhelming response. What they noticed on Alpha was something different. It was not the scale of fire. It was the absence of wasted motion. Through liaison channels and shared feeds, American officers saw how British sections moved in tight, deliberate elements. They advanced in small bounds. They confirmed before committing. They cleared structures fully before shifting axes. No rush to dramatize progress. No visible anxiety about proving speed. And perhaps most striking, no visible overreaction to uncertainty. Marines are trained to read battlefield behavior. They pay attention to spacing, to rate of fire, to how quickly a unit reorients after unexpected contact. On Al-Faw, what they saw was consistency. When small Iraqi resistance elements fired from concealed positions, British return fire was measured. Suppression was applied only where needed. Engineers were moved forward only after sectors were secured. Communications traffic remained procedural. There was no spike of chaos in the command net. That detail matters more than most civilians understand. In degraded conditions, the first thing that collapses is usually clarity. Radio chatter increases, orders overlap, units duplicate effort. Firepower escalates because uncertainty breeds volume. None of that happened. What Marines noticed was that 40 Commando operated inside the storm, as if they had already accepted uncertainty as normal. There was also something subtler. The British did not treat the oil infrastructure as secondary to the fight. American Marines were accustomed to destroying targets that threatened movement. British forces were clearly operating under a different constraint, secure without unnecessary damage. That meant tighter fire discipline near pumping stations, more controlled use of heavy weapons, greater emphasis on physical clearing rather than standoff destruction. It required confidence. It also required trust in small unit leadership. Marines watching understood that such restraint cannot be ordered into existence at the last moment. It reflects training culture. Another detail stood out: posture after contact. Once key objectives were secured, British Marines did not remain in aggressive overwatch posture longer than necessary. They shifted to controlled security, established perimeter discipline, and began coordination with follow-on units almost immediately. The transition from assault to stabilization was smooth. That fluidity, shifting gears without dramatic signaling, impressed more than any firefight. Later, one Marine officer reportedly summarized the impression in simple professional terms. They didn't fight the storm. They operated inside it. That comment was not praise in a theatrical sense. It was acknowledgement of competence under friction, and for professional soldiers that is high respect. The differences were not loud. They were structural. The U.S. Marine Corps in 2003 was operating under a doctrine refined through Desert Storm and years of maneuver warfare theory. Speed creates shock. Shock creates collapse. Firepower enables speed. The British approach on Al-Faw reflected something shaped elsewhere. Northern Ireland, the Balkans, decades of smaller wars where firepower alone did not solve the problem. On paper, both forces were professional, modern, and interoperable. On the ground, the contrast was visible. American Marines tended to clear and push. British Marines tended to secure and confirm. That difference does not imply hesitation. It reflects emphasis. For U.S. units, momentum is often preserved through continuous forward pressure. If resistance is light, you exploit immediately. For 40 Commando, momentum that night was defined by control rather than speed. They did not advance faster simply because resistance was minimal. They advanced when sectors were stabilized. To a Marine officer watching through shared operational feeds, this registered as discipline, but also as restraint. Another difference was in force packaging. American units often mass combat power at the point of contact to end engagements decisively. British sections appeared more distributed, operating in smaller elements with clear autonomy. That autonomy matters. It means junior leaders are trusted to interpret intent without constant direction. It also means fewer visible command interventions once the fight begins. The Marines noticed the absence of mid-level correction on the radio nets. Orders were given clearly, once. Adjustments were local. Then there was fire discipline. U.S. doctrine at the time emphasized overwhelming response to suppress ambiguity. If a position fires, suppress it heavily, then move. British response appeared more selective. Fire was applied precisely where needed. There was less saturation, more discrimination. In the confined industrial terrain of Al-Faw, near critical oil infrastructure, that distinction had operational significance. Marines observing understood something immediately. This was not caution. It was calculated economy. The British were not fighting less aggressively. They were fighting with narrower margins. Another point of divergence was how each force treated uncertainty. American training often treats uncertainty as something to dominate through tempo and initiative. British training, shaped by long counterinsurgency experience, treats uncertainty as something to manage through patience and verification. Inside a sandstorm, that philosophical difference becomes practical. One approach attempts to overpower ambiguity. The other attempts to outlast it. Neither is inherently superior. Each reflects different historical experience. But on that first night beside 40 Commando, the Marines recognized they were watching a method not identical to their own. And professional soldiers are always curious when they see competence expressed differently. Inside a sandstorm, that philosophical difference becomes practical. One approach attempts to overpower ambiguity. The other attempts to outlast it. Neither is inherently superior. Each reflects different historical experience. But on that first night beside 40 Commando, the Marines recognized they were watching a method not identical to their own. And professional soldiers are always curious when they see competence expressed differently. Al-Faw was not chosen for symbolism. It was chosen because of oil. Roughly 80% of Iraq's export capacity moved through terminals, pipelines, and pumping stations connected to that narrow peninsula. If those facilities were destroyed in the opening hours of the war, the consequences would not have been tactical. They would have been strategic. In 1991, retreating Iraqi forces had set Kuwait's oil fields ablaze. The fires burned for months. The environmental damage was severe. The economic shock was global. No one at Central Command wanted to repeat that. The task assigned to 40 Commando and associated units was not simply to seize ground. It was to prevent demolition. That is a different mission profile. Destroying enemy forces is straightforward. Protecting complex industrial infrastructure in a contested environment is not. The Marines understood that immediately. Oil terminals are layered with pipes, pressure systems, volatile compounds, and pre-positioned demolition charges. A single explosion in the wrong location can ignite secondary systems beyond immediate control. As reports filtered through the night, American officers began to appreciate the scale of what the British were attempting. They were conducting an amphibious assault. in a sandstorm, at night, against irregular defenders. That combination narrowed their margin for error. High-volume suppressive fire risked igniting what they were trying to protect. Heavy ordnance was not always an option. The British were required to clear buildings, secure pumping stations, and neutralize defenders without turning the facility into a firestorm. That constraint shaped everything. It explains the controlled fire discipline. It explains the deliberate sector clearing. It explains the absence of large-scale bombardment prior to insertion. By dawn, key terminals were in British hands. Demolition attempts had been prevented. Pumping stations were secured. The environmental disaster planners feared did not materialize. For the Marines observing, the significance became clear only in retrospect. If those terminals had burned, coalition strategy in southern Iraq would have changed overnight. Reconstruction funding, regional stability, and international political support would all have been affected. The first night was not just about tactical competence. It prevented an economic and ecological shock, and the Marines knew it. When they later discussed that night, they did not focus on heroics. They focused on the fact that the oil infrastructure remained intact. In war, sometimes the most important outcome is what did not happen. Al-Faw did not burn, and that was not accidental. Public statements after joint operations are predictable. They emphasize unity. They avoid specifics. They do not linger on surprise. Private reactions are different. In the days following the seizure of Al-Faw, American Marine officers and senior NCOs had the opportunity to review after-action summaries, speak directly with British counterparts, and compare notes on what had occurred during the sandstorm. The tone was not theatrical. It was analytical. One Marine battalion commander reportedly remarked that what stood out was not aggression, but composure. He noted that under reduced visibility and degraded communications, the British units did not accelerate unnecessarily. They did not compensate for uncertainty with volume of fire. They continued to execute their plan as written. Another Marine officer, reviewing the sequence of events, observed that the British had accepted the weather as a factor rather than treating it as a temporary obstacle to be overcome through force. That distinction mattered. Instead of trying to dominate the storm, they moved within it. At the company level, conversations were more direct. Marines who had prepared for large-scale resistance admitted they had expected confusion among the British formations once helicopters lifted off in near-zero visibility. Instead, reports described tight landing dispersion, controlled initial contact, and rapid consolidation of positions. A senior Marine NCO later summarized it in simpler language. They did not waste motion. There was also recognition of risk tolerance. Flying into that storm was not a symbolic act. Aircraft could have turned back. The mission could have been delayed. No one would have questioned the decision. The British chose to proceed. Marine officers understood what that implied. It was not recklessness. It was an acceptance that delay would create greater risk. To the infrastructure, to the broader operational timeline, and to coalition credibility. In informal discussions, some Marines noted the absence of theatrics. There was no visible attempt to impress, no emphasis on spectacle. The operation appeared routine in its execution, even though conditions were far from routine. That impression left an impact. Professional militaries measure one another quietly. After Al-Faw, there was no open praise in the moment. There did not need to be. But among Marine officers, there was acknowledgement that 40 Commando had demonstrated a standard that would be difficult to exceed under similar conditions. The comments were not about valor. They were about control. And in a sandstorm at night, control is rare. Joint operations are often described in terms of shared objectives. In practice, they are tests of confidence. Every coalition partner brings its own doctrine, tempo, and assumptions about risk. Alignment is not automatic. It must be earned in execution. The seizure of Al-Faw did not change the strategic direction of the war. Baghdad remained the primary objective. The main American thrust continued north. But what happened in the south reshaped an internal calculus. Before the invasion, American planners had assigned the British responsibility for the southern sector, partly out of respect, partly out of necessity. It was a critical area, but not the center of gravity. Al-Faw demonstrated something more than competence. It demonstrated independence under pressure. The British did not require American aviation to proceed. They did not wait for clearer skies. They did not ask for revised timelines. They executed. For American commanders observing from Qatar and from adjacent sectors, that mattered operationally. It meant the southern flank was secure without constant oversight. It meant American Marine units could concentrate on their own axis of advance without diverting assets south to stabilize unexpected problems. More importantly, it reinforced a long-standing but periodically tested assumption that the United Kingdom could operate not merely as an auxiliary force, but as a parallel one. In coalition warfare, perception affects allocation. After Al-Faw, British units were not treated as a contingent requiring supervision. They were treated as a formation capable of independent operational problem-solving. That distinction influences future planning. It shapes how responsibilities are divided, how risks are shared, and how trust is extended. Within NATO circles and American joint doctrine discussions in subsequent years, Al-Faw became one of several reference points illustrating how medium-sized forces could deliver decisive effects when doctrine, discipline, and clarity aligned. It did not create new alliances. It strengthened an existing one, and it did so not through rhetoric, but through performance in adverse conditions. On that night, reliability was demonstrated, and that has long-term consequences. The United States Marine Corps entered Iraq in 2003 with confidence in its doctrine. Speed, shock, combined arms momentum. The plan was to push north rapidly, bypass resistance where possible, and collapse the regime before it could adapt. The events at Al-Faw did not contradict that doctrine, but they expanded it. Among Marine officers, particularly those at regimental and division level, there was quiet professional observation taking place during the opening days of the war. They were not comparing uniforms or national pride. They were comparing methods under stress. Several elements stood out. First, the willingness to execute in degraded conditions without demanding ideal support. Marine aviation doctrine emphasizes flexibility, but American units in 2003 were accustomed to overwhelming enablers, precision air support, ISR platforms, satellite communications. At Al-Faw, 40 Commando proceeded in near-zero visibility with limited external support. That reinforced an older Marine principle sometimes overshadowed by technological abundance, mission-type orders, and decentralized execution. Second, the British approach to urban containment, seen later in Basra but foreshadowed in the Peninsula operations, showed an emphasis on shaping before striking. Marine doctrine had long discussed shaping operations, but observing them applied with patience in real time caused discussion, not disagreement, discussion. Officers later described how the British balance between aggression and restraint required a different form of confidence. In Marine professional education circles after 2003, particularly at Quantico and within unit-level after-action reviews, references to British methods began appearing in discussions about urban operations, stability phases, and transition from kinetic to security tasks. The Marine Corps already possessed a small wars manual dating back to the 1930s. What Al-Faw and subsequent Southern operations reinforced was that modern high-intensity war and stabilization were not separate categories. They could overlap within hours. Marines who watched Royal Marines fight in a sandstorm and then immediately transitioned to infrastructure security and civilian interaction saw that overlap embodied. It did not overturn Marine doctrine. It refined it. Conversations that would later shape counterinsurgency thinking, distributed operations, and decentralized command were influenced not only by Iraq broadly, but by specific early observations of coalition partners operating under pressure. Al-Faw became one of those reference points, not because it was the largest battle, but because it was an early proof of concept. In professional military culture, examples matter. Officers remember moments where assumptions were tested and held, or adjusted. For some Marines in 2003, the first night beside 40 Commando became one of those moments.